latest novel, Luminarium, a man enters a strange scientific study about inducing spiritual experiences, falls hard for his experimenter, and starts getting email somehow from his comatose brother. Luminarium was the winner of the 2011 Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Fiction, named an editor's choice by the New York Times, a notable book by the Washington Post, best book of the year by Publishers Weekly, Book List, and other periodicals. And his first novel, The Savage Girl, was selected as a New York Times notable book and has been widely translated. His short story collection, City in Love, was a winner of the FC2 National Fiction Competition. Please give a warm round of applause for Alex Shakar. Shakar. Alex Shakar. Sorry, thank you.
All right.
Okay, let's get adjusted here. Hi, thank you all for coming out. Those were all terrific readings. I'm really honored to be following you all. I empathize with the therapist experience. I feel like I've been there, and with trying to get together people in Wicker Park, although that's I was debating whether to read from Luminarium, my latest novel, or this new short story that I wrote. But I think I'm going to read the short story because it's kind of a fable, and Joshua, you started out with a sort of fable, so I thought it might round it out a little bit. So I'll read the first section of the short story, and that should take 12 minutes or maybe 13 if I read slow. Glasses on. I guess I don't really need to set it up. Oh, well, let me just say this though. If anybody's interested in Luminarium, I've got copies of it, and I've got copies of this Plowshares too. And this is it's actually a great issue. It's edited by Lauren Groff, and it's got a lot of sort of strange and surreal and funny stories in it. So it's an unusual issue for this magazine. Okay, so this is the start of a short story called In the Flesh We Shone. They met at a dinner party. She was young and blonde, he tall, dark, and dead. Seated beside him, she found it hard to stop watching his pale, veined fingers stroke the fabric of his placemat. She only knew her aunt here, whereas he seemed a friend to most. Across the table, a mousy guy with a mustache was talking about a long-ago boat trip in which the dead man, not then dead, had been swung out over the sea by a sail in a storm before swinging back to calmly tie it down and save the day. He looked about as ruffled then as he does now, the mousy man said to Chuckles. We had him reanimated, the hip, middle-aged hostess leaned in to tell Jill, because our gatherings just wouldn't have been the same. Oh? He must have a mordant wit, the young woman said. She'd felt bold at the outset, but by the time she'd spoken, she doubted herself, wondered if, as a stranger, she didn't have the right, and almost added the terrible mistake of not looking at him and including him in the joke. I'm afraid I've never been the life of the party, he said. The women laughed. His voice, low and gentle, made her skin charge. Maybe it was only her mind that for a second heard in it an otherworldly harmonic. It was mainly for those eyes, the hostess stage whispered, those eyes, blue-green, recessed, with which the corpse modestly beheld his empty plate, seemed then geological, the heart of some million-year stone just opened to daylight. But as part of his overall expression, she soon saw, they could look amused, appreciative, if just a bit wistfully detached, as if he were watching old home movies. After some small talk about the unpredictable weather, she was new to Chicago winters, he drew her out, and she told him about her life, what little there was to tell. To get away from her sleepy central Illinois town, she'd gone to college in California, then found a marketing job at a tech startup where she worked for 3 years until the company imploded. She was here now for grad school, anthropology, pursuing a kind of vision she'd had one day. In the cafeteria of the building where her startup had been based, she'd watched a guy play checkers against a Muppet-eyed robot, the machine craning and dropping the pieces from square to square. Then, heading home on the train, she'd noticed a half-dozen people moving little colored jewels around on their phones. It had struck her that society was a kind of dream, and that maybe her own life had amounted to nothing more than moving jewels around. An image had flashed in her mind. She'd seen herself working in the dirt, unearthing cookware shards and bones. Of course, that's probably just moving jewels around too, she said. Probably there's no escaping it. Around the table, silverware clattered, people exclaimed, reacted, belaboring more appropriate subjects, she assumed. She felt silly for airing her vague disgruntlement with life to a dead man. And if this dinner party woke up from its dream, he said, what would happen then? I don't know, she said. Maybe we'd dance on the tables. Or the whole thing would be a dance. He flipped a pill into his white wine and watched it fizz to orange. Games, dances, there seemed little difference. She supposed the dead had no direct line to wisdom. But as she looked around the overcrowded dining room, for a moment the pink meat hopped into people's mouths. The watches and bracelets flipped their captive arms to display themselves. Jessica, the hostess, turned back and forth to wind up the men to either side, and she herself, Jill Vale, set against it all a little less, was executing her head tilt lip purse maneuver, was flirting, in other words, with a goner. I guess I'm dancing with death then. You're a live one, aren't you? Is that your only criteria? The blanket lost to the floor, Jill nestled under his arm along the length of his side. Rigor mortis has its uses, he said. You've been saving that one up, haven't you? He wasn't cold. His skin was warmer than room temperature. She'd ascertained that much on the night of the party when he'd taken her hands and said goodbye. And now that she was flushed and sweaty, his skin felt pleasant, like wax cooling from a candle and still slightly malleable. On their first night out, she'd been surprised to see him shiver in an outdoor Christmas market for German crafts downtown. They'd drunk mulled wine, his spiked with his neon orange pills, in a temporary beer hall of folding tables under a billowing tarpaulin. She talked mostly about herself again, and as she'd expected, he seemed not to mind. For some time, she'd needed to talk things out with someone more impartial than her sister Cindy, her usual confidant, someone sympathetic, but not to the point of taking on her own worry and reflecting it back at her. It was a lonely, uprooted time. She'd left a non-committal boyfriend who seemed always on the verge of leaving her, as well as what could have been a lucrative career, to come to school in a place she barely knew anyone. She'd done it hastily, and maybe stupidly, and the classes were interesting, but slow, and she didn't know if she had the patience. He asked good questions, listened intelligently, if that was a thing. She scanned the air in front of him when he spoke. Seeing no steam, she felt a ticklish chill, then a luscious warmth at the sight of her own voluminous puffs as she went on talking. As for his life, his ex-life, he'd been an engineer or something, the kind that makes buildings, a bachelor, no kids, though he'd had his heart broken if she had to guess. She didn't ask much. It could have been impolite. After all, what did any of that matter now? Tonight, she'd asked him to tell her more, but not too much more. Not too much more? No, just one fact. They were in a hotel bar. He was developing an affinity, he said, for transient places. She'd gotten drunk, and he'd at least pretended to, alcohol mainly a preservative for him, plunking pills into his martinis, waiting for them to fluoresce and effervesce. He said he'd worked on some of the tallest buildings in the world. Why is it every chance you give him, a man will try to talk about his penis? She'd shocked him, she saw. Leave it to her to shock a corpse. Then a few yellow chalk teeth peeked from his ashen lips. Oh, Am I the one talking about it? An enormous mirror ran the length of the wall over the bar, reflecting the whole low-lit, tourist-filled room around them. But of themselves, all she could make out over the bottles were the tops of their heads. She wanted more, wanted to see how they looked together. As they walked to the river through a soft snowfall, he told her about the buildings around them, about a roaring 20s jewelry building with an elevator for armored cars, about a building whose marble facade had crumbled from the winters and had to be replaced with granite. He talked about one he'd wanted to make if he could only have persuaded an architect to design it, a developer to finance it. It would have been shaped like an hourglass, with beams twisting in the middle like Mobius strips, so slender there it would seem to defy gravity. If not in Chicago, then in Dubai or Bahrain. He liked to envision it surrounded by sand. What's a Mobius strip again? He was skewing his joined fingertips, talking about counter-twisting cores and equilibrated tubes. Something like that, but she barely listened, instead thrilling to the touch of his broad, dead hand on her lower back. The dead feel, mostly due to his gloves and her coat, she knew, but so what? And sneaking glances at their ghostly images in storefront glass. Back in her bathroom, while he sat being sniffed at uncertainly by her cat on the couch, she posed in the mirror under the dressing room bulbs, admiring her full, rosy cheeks, the curves within her jeans and top, her breathily parted lips juicy as a starlet's. It wasn't like her. She wasn't normally vain, usually the opposite. She knew herself as anxious, time-haunted, feeling in her 20s as if her prime had already passed. And what use had she made of it? But with the dead man, his name was Felix, but to her friends and in her mind, he was still the dead man. She saw herself as she felt he must have, mouth-wateringly vital. She didn't know what her deal was. She'd never even liked vampire movies as a teen. In the bedroom, though the light was out, she made sure the door was cracked, the street light sufficient to show their naked forms in her full-length mirror. She let him look first, kissing him, feeling for his tongue with her own, giving it a little lick, pretending every new place she touched she was bringing to life, and every place he touched he was bringing to death. She turned and pressed against him, running the backs of her arms up over his shoulders, clasping his neck. He was only slightly paler than she in the mirror, but in her imagination he crested around her like a glowing moon. "It's only our second date," she whispered afterward. "Do you think I'm a whore?" She'd have felt mocked if his tone weren't a little earnest. "Yes. Who do I call about a dead hooker in my room?" He laughed, the first time she'd heard him do so, and she felt a surge of accomplishment. It had been her wildness more than her easiness that had made her ask for reassurance. "Act fast," her sister Cindy had advised over video chat. "I heard they can decay after a couple weeks." Not remotely true, Jill had argued. A few of the first ones were still going after a year. Though, true enough, it wouldn't be long. And this, more than the necrophilic thrill, was what Jill had wanted. Part of the satisfaction she imagined would come from quite possibly being the dead man's last, no woman to follow her, and peace of mind would come from the certainty that tonight couldn't go anywhere. It wouldn't matter, and this wouldn't feel bad, because she'd know going in that it couldn't. Dude's already gone. Which was why it had been fine just now to wrap him a little too tightly, to run her lips on his bluish nipple, to inhale the sweetish, faintly naphthalene smell of his skin. Yet her second date remark surprised her for another reason. She hadn't intended a third. "Just my luck," he said, running 2 fingers ever so slowly down the side of her face. Maybe it was just the dead thing, but maybe it had been so too in life. He had this way of looking at her. She felt she was being beheld by quasars, black holes, the milk of the Milky Way. "What's just your luck?" And something leaped and plunged even before he replied. "That I never once met you in all my life." I'll stop there, but you can, if you want, I've got copies of this. You can finish the story and see what happens. Thank you once again. Thanks, Andrew and Eden. Enjoyed doing this.